Hola a todos, bienvenidos al panel de Kubernetes en Nerdearla. Mi nombre es María Cruz, soy Program Manager en la Google Open Source Programs Office y estamos acá en un panel donde van a participar Hen Goldberg, Don Hen, Eric Brewer y Tim Hawking. Y ahora voy a cambiar a hacer las preguntas en inglés y entiendo que la traducción tal vez va a estar disponible más tarde, aunque no en simultáneo. So, hello everybody, can you hear me okay? Yes, thank you.
Yes.
So thank you for participating. A lot of the participants of this conference have watched the Kubernetes documentary where all of you star or have interviews. And so I prepared some questions, and there might be also some questions from the audience. So the first set of questions I have are about choosing open source for Kubernetes. And I didn't really think of asking these questions to anyone in particular within the panel, so feel free to speak up and also to respond to other people's responses as well. So the first question I have is, what was your initial motivation to create Kubernetes, or motivations, and why did you think it had to be open source?
I'm happy to try to answer that. I think you have to understand at the time we were in a world where cloud was made of VMs and disks, and it was frankly kind of low level. So the first answer is we would like a much more abstract cloud that is much more productive. And the second part is, well, that's a big change. We can't do that by ourselves. Let's make it open source and try to get a bunch of other companies to join us in this journey.
Awesome. So it was about opening participation, and that is actually another question that I had connected to that. Because in 2016, when Kubernetes was released, one of the ideas that comes up in the documentary is that it was released to empower people to build the cloud. So how would you describe the value of having more players shaping cloud computing?
Don, do you want to take that one first?
Yes, let me try to answer this question. So just like Eric mentioned that we try to build up a more high level of the concept of the cloud computing. So the birth of the Kubernetes shifts the developers the focus and the effort from management machines to the management applications. So first, Kubernetes could greatly simplify system scaling and management. And also with the Kubernetes on cloud and ease of the multiple cloud portability built in the gene, and could open the business to control over their cloud technology, and also accelerating the trend move toward migrate to the cloud. Meanwhile, also Kubernetes demonstrate it helps the developer decreasing of the administration and operational cost, and also decrease about the resource management cost. That's also create of the incentive for the developer and the company and move to cloud.
So it's connected to building something that is really big and being able to do it across multiple companies or multiple contributors allows you to grow faster. A lot of people were really interested in understanding what was the value proposition that convinced Google leadership that open source was the way to go. Because it's at the time, I think, and even, at the time it was seen as a very innovative way of contributing to tech. And in the documentary, it transpires that it wasn't easy, and so a lot of people were curious about this. If you can speak to that.
Yeah, I can take that one. There's always a tension between giving away the business and wanting to grow the market for the addressable space. We had looked at what had happened in the past, where Google had done really interesting research and published research and then not followed through on the research with implementations. And you could see it in other projects like MapReduce and Hadoop. And we made a pretty convincing argument, I think, that it was better for us, it was better for Google, the company, and it was better for the world if we followed through, didn't just publish ideas, but actually went through and made it work so that we could help steer the bigger conversation. We didn't think it was something we could do alone.
And so how would you describe the unique value that open source brought to Kubernetes?
I can take this one. So first of all, open source, generally speaking, has a lot of value for building new technologies, with creating communities, for example, but specifically for Kubernetes, it created three things that are unique. The first one was the promise that this technology will work everywhere. And by making that open source, it was actually possible for us, with the help of others, to test that and make sure that it works on different hardware and different clouds. And that continues to be one of the value propositions of using a technology like Kubernetes and its support for hybrid and multi-cloud. The second thing was evaluating different use cases, so maturing the technology faster was really important by having a community around it. And last but not least, one of the things that we see everywhere in technology is the power of an ecosystem. So having other players and other companies and other users fill the gaps quicker than what a single vendor can. And I think that creating that ecosystem really accelerated the adoption of Kubernetes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this summary of how open source as a way of doing technology really contributed to Kubernetes being the amazing project that it is today. The next set of questions that I have are around technical questions and good practices. And so in conversation with some people in the IT sector, in particular sysadmin, the issue of updates came up a lot. And so given the intense rhythm that Kubernetes has of updates, a brief data point is I think in the last 2 years it went through 10 different versions. So do you have any recommendations or best practices for updating? And is there a standard process to follow, or is it simply to replace controllers and progressively drain nodes?
I can try to take this bigger question. We did publish a lot of best practice, and from the high level, the steps you are going to perform always is like upgrade of the control plane nodes, and upgrade of the nodes in your cluster, and upgrade client such as the kubectl. And for each the different type of the nodes, like control plane nodes, so they also we publish some of the best practice depending on your tool you are using. For example, if you are using Kubernetes, so you need the first update of your Kubernetes. Then you train your control node, and then perform of Kubernetes upgrade, and then update of your kubectl and Kubernetes on that control plane node. So then you then you uncontrol of your control plane nodes. So bring that back to make that is schedulable and bring back to your cluster. And then you have to verify, right? So always verify. Similar steps to the your worker nodes, which is run your application and your services. Similar step, but we also suggest you, because before you upgrade, you look at your you also before that we always look at of your pod disrupted budget and then make sure those is properly configured, and before you start the whole upgrade and join the node. So there's the many published of the doc on the best practice for open source based on your tools you are using. So yeah.
And maybe if I can add, definitely with Kubernetes, things have matured and advanced. And today, all cloud providers, of course, have managed Kubernetes, right? So Google has Google Kubernetes Engine, and that's probably the easiest way to start with Kubernetes and letting us do the heavy lifting for you.
Great. And so another question that is also in the technical area, across IT teams, many wonder how to best coordinate working groups to make the most of what Kubernetes can offer. And so this includes a dialogue among sysadmin and developers about the operating system they are using. So what would you say is the minimum knowledge required a developer must have about Kubernetes? And would you recommend doing more abstraction layers over Kubernetes so that it can seem easier for developers?
I'll jump on that one. From the very beginning, from the earliest slide decks that we wrote about Kubernetes, when we were showing it to anybody who would listen to us, we had a slide. I remember writing the slide. It was about Kubernetes as two different stories. There's a story for the people who administer the clusters, and there's a story for the people who use those clusters. And it's not the same story. And so the question, I think, is how much does a developer need to know about Kubernetes in order to use Kubernetes? So I think it's generally a good idea that they understand the core ideas, the idea of declarative configuration and asynchronous reconciliation, the idea of scale out versus scale up, the idea of service decoupling from workloads. I think if you can understand those basic ideas, then you can use Kubernetes pretty effectively. It shouldn't be magic for anybody. There's really not a lot of brand new ideas in Kubernetes. It's just better organized, maybe, or organized differently, so that people can take advantage of the system doing the hard parts for them, or the boring parts for them. But every organization is different. Every team who uses Kubernetes is different. And it's hard to say without context how much they should make their teams learn about Kubernetes. Some teams want to know more about Kubernetes and they have a capacity for that and they have the time for it, and other teams don't. And so it kind of comes back to answering a question with a question, and the response is, how much do you as your business want to own the opinion of how to do things within your business? If you want to give teams a lot of flexibility and freedom, then letting them use Kubernetes directly is a reasonable answer. If you want to be very rigid and consistent in how they manage things, then building layers on top of Kubernetes is completely appropriate. And we've seen lots and lots of people do it. And in fact, one of the big goals of the Kubernetes project is to make it possible and even easy to build those layers so that you can own more of the opinionated stack.
So I think it does boil down to understanding your developers and all of your IT team as different users, and understanding what kind of user they are and what context they operate in to make this more accessible according to how much capacity they have. What are your thoughts on companies that have on-prem infrastructure that lack a lot of ease of cloud infrastructure and want to adopt Kubernetes? Do you have any recommendations for a successful hybrid infrastructure?
So I can definitely start with that. First of all, there's a lot of companies and many of our customers that are running successfully Kubernetes on premises in their private cloud at scale. So that's definitely a pattern that we see very often, and doing it together with a cloud deployment. I think the first thing that I would recommend is having a business purpose of why do we want actually to use Kubernetes on-prem or in the cloud. What we hear a lot of customers is that they want to improve velocity, so the speed where they can actually innovate or doing some new development for example, within their context of the business. So really that's very important. And the reason is because what we most often hear from customers that although it is hard to start with the technology, adopting a technology like Kubernetes implies other changes within the team. So it means a lot of process change and culture change and how you build applications. So it's not just managing Kubernetes itself, the cluster and the environment, but also how you build your applications, establishing DevOps processes, and maybe having new gates of how you deploy to production. So without that important business purpose, I think it can create more obstacles or maybe less motivation to move forward. And last but not least, so like from being practical, again, there are a lot of companies that can actually help with that. Also both managed services, again, Google would have an Anthos solution for that context. There is others like Red Hat, for example, as well. And so starting with that and bringing those expertise is where I would definitely start. And last, I would also suggest just learning Kubernetes, starting in the cloud is always easier, just even to understand the basics.
I think, this is really interesting because it always depends on what is the business case or what business are you trying to get to. And I thought what was really interesting about your response, Hen, was you mentioning cultural change, because what is changing is the way you develop infrastructure in the cloud when you're moving to hybrid. Which takes me to the next question, which is how should developers think of Kubernetes in comparison with other standard computer instances?
I can try to take this question. So this is how the Google internal infrastructure org initially gives to me. So with this container technology and container orchestration, I feel this is the enable of the developer and empower your increase of your impact. So you could quickly test your stuff and quickly roll out your stuff, and also make that incremental development and much easier. Also, this Kubernetes provide an easy way for us to scale our application, our services much easier compared to the virtual machines. And also it keeps the code, the operational and the speed up the delivery process, all those kind of things. So, and also Kubernetes API allow the automating a lot of resource management and provisioning tasks. So earlier team touch base as an application developer, right? So you don't need to be the expert on the Kubernetes, but you should be, if you want Kubernetes to do you a favor and help you, so you still need to be proficient on certain skills and which what kind of the impact your performance of your applications and services. For example, of the skill of the understanding, the CI/CD and the deployment to the production, monitoring, observability, and to help you to scale up and monitoring the fleet-wide of the healthiness of your services. Those kind of the skills help you, but those skills can be developed over the work, right? Incrementally. It's not like require of you immediately mask those kind of things. So that's what I'm thinking about the Kubernetes, and also like the container technology were powerful. Yeah.
So, anyone wanted to add anything to that, or? Okay. So think of it as, to take some ideas from your response, Don, to think of it as a set of tools that allow you to transform your infrastructure step by step and progressively grow the support of your applications. What tools do you use to manage your clusters? Just kubectl, and I know there's some conversation about how to pronounce this, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. So just kubectl and Vim, or do you recommend any plugin or client that can make it easier to manage?
So I work on Kubernetes, but I also use Kubernetes for my own projects. For me, I like the transparency of just using the command line tools and simple editing of YAML myself. It means that I can look around the internet and find good examples. Even I have to go find examples sometimes because I don't know the whole system as well as you might expect. And so I have to find examples of where the right API is doing the things that I want to do. And that works for me. I don't know that that works at large scale, but it works for small scale pretty well. Obviously, I check all my stuff into Git, and I use that as my source of truth. I'm not personally using a Git ops flow, but if I had more than one small cluster, I probably would. There's a multitude of Git ops tools out there that people can and probably should look at and be using. And as you grow, the number of other things that are coming out of our community, the ecosystem, to manage lots of clusters is actually pretty staggering. There's a lot of tools and management layers and things that are supposed to make life easier to automate those things. So I wouldn't shy away from those, but I personally find it very valuable to understand the bottommost layer. I don't know, Dawn?
Yeah, I agree with the team. As the developer, I'm definitely using Kubernetes and all those standard things. I also, open source have also provide some of the open source tool for management cluster. That's like COPS is the one of this quite powerful, and offer of the cluster creation management for both GCP and AWS. Of course, I also work on the GKE and Ansos. So we are also provide the product, right? So there's along with some other vendor, Kubernetes vendor, we provide to make that cluster management much easier for our customer. So that's many things you can try. Yeah.
It's worth saying that it's a lot easier to create a cluster on GKE, especially with autopilot. So, being someone a step removed from using this every day, I play with it in GKE, and then I use kubectl mostly to do queries about what's going on. So I use a bit of a mix, but creating a cluster on GKE is remarkably easy.
Great. So it sounds like different tools can work, but it's like with other responses, it depends on the scale and it depends on the implementation. And definitely managed services like GKE can make it all way easier. Let's focus a little bit on knowledge of Kubernetes, and the next few questions are about the knowledge gap. So I read in the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation 2021 report that 96% of the surveyed organizations are using Kubernetes in production or considering the technology for production use. And what I learned talking to some cloud consultants is that they observe a gap between this growing popularity and the necessary knowledge to properly install Kubernetes. So do you have any ideas on how this knowledge gap can be addressed?
Yes, and that's definitely top of mind and comes up in every customer meeting that we are having. So first of all, talent shortage is real. It's real in our industry, and it's also true for the Kubernetes space. But definitely for all the professionals that are listening to us here, I also want to highlight how that's an opportunity to acquire new skills for a pretty young technology. It hasn't been so long. It's less than 10 years for this technology to exist. So first of all, there is an opportunity for people here, and I want to encourage folks to learn the technology and the space. And there is lots of tools out there. You heard Tim himself, he's Googling stuff when he needs things. And I find the Kubernetes community overall is very welcoming as well with questions. And I know sometimes it's hard and we don't feel comfortable asking questions and so on. I really want to encourage folks to do that, because there's most likely other people that don't know what you're asking. So simply ask. So that's one thing that definitely for all the professionals. From a team perspective, I think there is no magic there. So it's either, of course, hiring and creating some training, getting help with vendors in order to close that gap, unless any managed service definitely helps to close that gap.
Great. So leaning on the community is super important to continue to learn about Kubernetes. We have less than 5 minutes for the close of the panel, so I'm going to jump to one question about the future. And just for those of us watching this online, if you want to ask questions now would be the time. I only have one question from the audience. So looking at the future, what is something that Kubernetes doesn't currently do, but you think should be able to do, and how do you see the future of the project?
Can I do this one? I'm going to cheat a little bit and go with something that we do, but not well enough. Kubernetes turns out to be two projects in one. It is a container management system that is running on an API serving infrastructure, but it's also that API serving infrastructure. And we didn't really plan for that, but it emerged and it turns out to be super, super useful. The thing that I think we need to do more of and better at is making that API serving platform serve more things than just Kubernetes. I'd actually like to see us split the project apart a little bit more so that everything that we do is defined in terms of the extensibility mechanisms so that it gets more flexible, more configurable, and you can use the Kubernetes infrastructure to solve your own problems as well as our container management system, right? So for example, we have custom resources, but it's still a little too cumbersome to define a fully functioning API in terms of what custom resources and webhook and mission controllers and everything else can do. We have a ton of work in progress that's going to make this better. I'm super excited about it. I won't go into it here, we don't have all the time, but I'm super excited about a handful of projects that are pushing ahead, making this more powerful and more flexible.
Any other thoughts from anyone else about the future or what you would like to see?
Maybe I can also give. I totally agree with the team, but another thing I also want to add is Kubernetes have a reputation for a long time from day one, and being difficult. There's the big learning curve about that way. So I think of at least from community, I think a lot of the challenge we have make it boring, easy to use for many folks. So we've been doing that. Even the reliability, we are I think since last year, we are focused on the reliability a lot. That is also kind of the effort we try to make that boring and settle down on the core functionality, and then we can extend it, support more resource and more device, and also support more workloads, different type of the workloads, make that each different type of the workloads is much easier and to schedule and running on the Kubernetes. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. We have one question from the audience. Sebastian wants to know, how do you convince, we kind of touched on this in the beginning, how do you convince C-level that releasing tools as open source is not empowering your own competitors?
I could take a stab at that. A lot of it depends on, is the thing you're releasing really the secret sauce that is the winning move, or is it something that's enabling an ecosystem where you'll have many partners? And if you're enabling others to work with you, that's a good time to release something. If it really is your secret sauce, then yeah, you should be nervous releasing it. In our case, we were trying to change the entire industry. We're not going to do that by ourselves. We have to create an ecosystem. That was, I think, in retrospect, clearly the right choice. It was a bit controversial at the time because it's a new space, and we did have some, secret sauce, at least some at the time, that we could have used for a private product. But a private product would not have had the impact that Kubernetes had, clearly.
One of the things I talk to a lot of teams about when they're thinking about open sourcing something is is this something that a reasonable team of software people could come up with in 6 months? If the answer is, yeah, probably, then it's not your secret sauce. Or if it is, you have a different problem. And so if you're enabling things, like you're changing the industry or you're enabling a new layer to be built, then I think open source is a great answer. And something they use in English, I hope it translates well, is the adjacency of the possible. You don't know what's possible until you solve the first problem, and then you can see all the second problems.
Wonderful. And with this amazing reflection about the power of open source, I want to thank you, Hen, Don, Eric, and Tim, for joining this panel virtually. And yes, thank you very much, and we'll come to a close.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.